that's life. That's what all the people say. You're riding high in April, shot down in May. But I know I'm gonna change that tune when I'm back on top in June. I said that's life.
Now we're recording.
So we are live.
Well, not live.
I mean, we're live right now.
We're live.
But we got guests, Mark Lowe, previously from Rockford Fallsgate. How you doing, Mark?
Doing good. Thanks for the invite.
And I wish everyone could see what I'm looking at right now, but at first I thought he was in a shop of some sort, but turns out it's just his garage. Part one of his garage, because we'd spoken a little earlier. Got a bigger set out back, but nice little setup here. Even got a sewing machine behind it.
The garage is nicer than my shop, that's for sure. At least the floors are nicer, that's for damn sure. Welcome, Mark. We have a bazillion questions, and I know a little bit about your history and timeline, but I am very interested to hear what got you into car audio, where you got started, cut your teeth. How did you get into it? When did that happen, and how did that happen?
Well, it really happened much like all of us. It was a high school thing. So when I got my first car or truck per se, a Jeep CJ7, when I was 15, I was already into home audio a little bit. So I started playing with car stuff, knew nothing. But we had a local dealer and they sold Kenwood. So started learning about that and, putting my first amp in and 6x9s in little tiny boxes and stuff like that, and just caught the bug from there. So I kept doing that for about a year until once I turned 16, just into that. I had that Jeep for about a year, and then I got a Trans Am my junior year of high school. And that's really kind of when it really clicked and started doing a lot more stuff, subwoofers and, components and stuff like that. So that would have been in like 1983 when I was doing that. So I actually got my first car audio job in 1984 when I was a junior in high school.
That's fun. That's a good high school job.
It was a good high school job. So it was I'm from a little town in Wyoming, Casper, Wyoming. So they were behind, they're behind on everything, still are, I'm sure. So what we thought was pretty cool back then, obviously compared to other areas of the country, we were way behind. But probably the thing I remember most in my early career was when I got the first Sony CD player in 1984 when that first came out. And I was the only one in town that had one because the Sony dealer was where I was working and we only ordered one. So that was like the first DIN radio I had to put in because of course the Trans Am was a shaft dash setup. So it was pretty cool to have that CD player in 1984, but I quickly realized that there was no content.
Yeah.
I was
about to say 1984. What was the first CD you threw in that thing?
Madonna, Like a Virgin.
This is part of Matt's trivia question. Matt, what was the first CD ever created?
I was just trying to remember that. I'm like, this used to be a trivia question I used to give.
Was it like Springsteen?
I think it's
or something?
Springsteen.
Like Born in the USA or something?
It's definitely a USA type song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I quickly realized that, especially living in a smaller town, about, 10% of the stuff we wanted to listen to maybe was available on CD. So that CD player actually was short-lived because it just drove me crazy because I couldn't listen to any of the content I wanted because it just wasn't available yet. So I worked at that first car audio store. It was a place called Harmony Car Stereo, and it was this one guy named Vern Miller that owned it. And I owe that guy a lot. He gave me my first break and taught me a lot. So the thing I remember is he showed me how to do these speakers on a truck, and he takes a grill and he puts it on the door panel and he traces it out, and he's showing me how to use a razor knife to first cut the vinyl. And then he shows me this really cool thing of using this, box cutter, and he uses it at an angle and it cuts the cardboard, fiberboard stuff of the door panel like really easy. It was shocking to me how easy he was cutting it just by angling. And I'm like, God, this guy is like God. He's amazing. So he had the door panels off, actually, and they were on the bench. And so he marks out the left one, then marks out the right one. And you remember on those old trucks, the door panel was just flat. And, the front of it looked basically like the back of it. So he marks out both of them, and he cuts both holes on the bench and goes to put the door panels back on the car to mark the metal to cut it. And I'm just watching him. He puts the first one on, driver's side, cuts the metal, and he's showing me how to cut it with tin snips and stuff I just had no idea about when I was 16 years old. So then we finish the driver's side door, and he goes over to the passenger door and snaps the door panel on. And I'm looking at him. My eyes are super big. I'm like, holy shit, something's not right here. He cut the hole in the back of the door instead of the front of the door. And so I'm not saying anything. I'm like, oh shit, I'm glad he did that, not me. And I just watched him, and he didn't say a word. He just took the door panel off, remarked it, cut another hole in the front to match the driver's side, put it back on, finished it, put the speakers in. And then he went over to his goodie box, or per se, of a bunch of speaker grills, and I see him digging through them to try to find a matching set. And he finds a set, and then he mounts the where he cut the wrong hole, he mounts a speaker grill over it. And he goes back to the driver's side, and he mounts another speaker grill on the back of that one. So again, I'm just watching. So the customer comes in, and he says to him, boy, we had a little bit of extra time in the shop today. We weren't real busy, so we kind of played around with your truck, and we realized we could port your door. And we got a lot better bass response out of it. And the customer's thrilled to death. Thinks, oh my gosh, these guys spent some extra time there and didn't charge me any money. And he was as happy as can be. And I guess what I realized at that point, and I thought about that almost through my entire career, was, we're all going to screw something up. It's not a question of if, it's when. And it's, you really, when you see how good you are, it's how good you can fix your mistakes, because we're all going to make them. And that was a good lesson for me early in my career. So
I wonder how many cars are rolling around with four speaker grills in the front doors.
So that was my first job. I was there about a year, and then I used to buy a lot of my product from another dealer in town called Team Electronics, and they were a Kenwood dealer, and had some of the higher end stuff. This store I was at mainly had Sony and back in that day Cricket, which was a kind of looks like a Fusion speaker per se, because it had a green surround and stuff. But those are kind of the main brands that we sold there. But I used to buy all my Kenwood stuff from this other place, Team Electronics. So I got to know the manager there real well. And so he offered me a job. I think at Harmony, he was paying me like $4 an hour or something back then. And Team offered me like $7 an hour as a, I think I just turned 17 maybe. I'm like, God, I'm really doing good. So I went and worked there for about 2 years. I did installs for about a year of it, and then I worked on the sales floor for about a year. So that was really my car audio career when I was in high school.
Now, in high school, did you work on like friends' cars and stuff like that, just naturally?
Yep, that's kind of how it started. Before I had that first job at Harmony, I did a lot of stuff in my garage, hacked some people's cars together. like all of us, not really knowing what I was doing. But it was, like all of us know, that's how you have to learn. So
yeah, it's definitely how it started for me. I was constantly working on people's cars in high school just for free, just to get experience.
yeah,
So that gets us up 87, 88-ish, maybe?
that gets.
87?
I graduated in '85, and I stayed there in Casper for 1 year. So in '86, I moved to go to school in Tucson.
Starting to connect dots
Yeah,
here.
so that brought you to Arizona.
Yep. So that brought me to Arizona. I worked at a place called The Specialists. The owner there his name is Charlie Weisel. They're still in business, and he's run a really good business for a long time. And he definitely, if I would say anybody probably in my career, he definitely, I owe a lot to him. And probably the reason why I say that is he just allowed me the freedom to experiment and made sure we had the tools and spent the money we needed to in those early days. And so we were in Tucson, and the big dealer in Tucson at that point was Classic Car Sounds. A guy named John Mangelli owned that. And if you go back to the NACA car audio days before IASCA, John Mangelli won one of those first events. And so they were the high-end dealer in Tucson by far back in those mid-'80s. And they were so ahead of everybody. They had a product that, only the old school guys will even know what it is, called Z-Box. So they were the very first people to do the car audio pod. A bunch of us think we invented the pod, but Z-Box was doing the pod before any of us. And there was a guy there, and I could be wrong on his first name, but I believe his name was Eric Zimmerman. So that's where Z came from, was Zimmerman, and the car audio box, the pod. So they mainly focused on the exotics at that time. So they had a lot of stuff for Porsche, Ferrari, stuff like that. They didn't really focus on the common car or truck, though, which ultimately really kind of was their downfall. Because, there's in Tucson, there's only so many people driving exotic cars. But,
for Matt, they were the OG stealth box.
Yeah.
They were the
way before there was ever a stealth box.
Yeah, because they did subwoofers, they did door pods, kick panels, they did all of it. And, it was so far ahead of its time, it was crazy. But the thing that they kind of did is they were really tight-lipped about everything to even their employees. So they kind of had their special little shop where these Z-Boxes were built, but all their installers knew nothing about it. All they did is install the pod, like a stealth box. Mm-hmm. But they didn't know how to build them or, do any of that custom work. They kept that really, secretive. So me being over at the Specialists, I was very intrigued by the Z-Box, and I knew nothing about fiberglass or anything like that. So I started playing around with, just doing some stuff out of wood, started doing it, and this sounds funny, but we mainly used Baltic birch, and we didn't use MDF. We just, we thought it sound-wise was better, and but it was, as we noted, try to shape and sand, birch like that is MDF is a superior material for that type of application. So we started experimenting with kitty hair and body filler and stuff like that, really nobody in that area was doing anything like that at the time. And, Tucson and, Phoenix are, especially back in those days, were huge car audio, mecca areas, with all the car audio manufacturers being in Phoenix. So we started playing with that and coming up with ways that we could build, little door pods and stuff like that. And so we started to get some traction and started to take business away ultimately from Classic Car Sounds. And it was because we could offer things that were different, where they could only sell the Z-Box that they had in stock. And we could build something custom, especially for the Chevy truck or the Ford truck, things they weren't offering. So that's kind of where the custom side really started for me, was in 1986 when I started at Specialist.
1986. Mark, I was born in 1987.
So that was kind of my introduction to Rockford Fosgate at that time. I knew a little bit about it when I was in Wyoming. One time a local rep came by and saw the stuff, but it wasn't very refined at that point. And I just didn't know that much about it. So at the Specialist, we became a dealer. I think it was 1987 was the year that we became a Rockford dealer. And just being curious, I got to know our sales manager from Rockford and our rep, and just asked a lot of questions. And everyone was so helpful back then. And that's around the time that Rockford started RTTI. So Ron Trout, which we all know, he's the pioneer of car audio training, really. And, RTTI obviously stands for Rockford Technical Training Institute, but we all, a lot of people always said it was really Ron Trout Technical Training Institute. So I got to go to one of Ron's classes back in 1987. And at that point I had a CRX, and I had 2 Power 650s in it and 2 18s, Power 18s, and a Sony 10 disc changer, of course. So I got to go to that RTTI session, and for me it was just like, oh my gosh, this is mind-boggling. Learning about passive crossovers and actually constructing them instead of just hooking them, the ins and outs up. I thought, at the time I thought, Ron Trout was just the god of car audio, which he kind of was. And I just looked up to that guy so much. And I remember leaving that RTTI class, and I'm driving back to Tucson, and I'm like, you know what? That's going to be me. I'm going to get there.
Love it.
So, he was a very motivating, guy in my early days. But back to that class, I remember being there, and Ron had a car. There was a tennis pro out of Las Vegas named Johnny Lane, and it was an IROC, and it had a TV in it, which was super cool at that point. And I think it had 18s in it too, 15s or 18s. And again, just going, seeing a car at that stage, which was so far beyond anything I had seen at that point, was super motivating to go back, to our shop and, want to apply some of the stuff that you saw and learned.
What about the transition? When did you start at Rockford?
So that was 87. Shortly after that RTTI class, I was maybe with the Specialist another 6 months, but I really got to know a lot of the guys at Rockford. And there was the regional sales manager for the West Coast. His name was Scott Schmidt. And him and I became pretty good buddies, and we decided to open a store in Chandler. So we opened a store called Competition Audio Research. And he still worked at Rockford, and I ran this store, and he would come and help after work. And that was the first build that I did for CES. So we built a Rockford Dodge Caravan that was the first CES car, 1987 display. So that was my first CES build. So I stayed with doing that for about a year, and I think I just kind of lost. I don't know if it was focus or really what to say, but it was kind of hard because it was just me.
Mm-hmm.
We were just small, so it was only me ever there, and I know I just kind of got burned out on it. So I ended up leaving that, and I went back to the specialist. Charlie had always just courted me back, and he just always treated me so good. And he told me, if you come back, we'll get you a custom shop away from our retail shop, and you can bring over whatever installers you want, and all you guys will do is high end. So that sounded pretty intriguing to me. So we opened this satellite specialist, and all the other guys, the installers that we didn't bring over, it rubbed some of them wrong. So they called us the Hollywood crew. So that, whenever anything came to us, it was, it's going over to Hollywood, because they thought, that was the image we had, that we were too good to be over there or something. So I ran that store for 2 more years. And that's when I got the contract to build 16 Rockford vans.
Oh, geez.
So we built the, we hear the, term Blastro van. Well, we built the original Blastro vans, 16 of them. And that was the one we built for Rock. So what we did is Rockford built one for each rep firm, or had one built for each rep firm. And then we built one for them. And that's back when Kevin Campbell was president of Rockford, or vice president of sales, I guess I think was what his title was. And we displayed that at CES in 89. So from there, Rockford had been courting me at that point to come to work. There was a regional sales manager at Rockford named Jerry Cave, which, a lot of us know who Jerry is. And, he was just really, again, someone who was really good to me early in my career. And he came to me one day, or called me one day and said, "Hey, why don't you come up to Tempe and let me take you to lunch?" So I came up to Tempe to go to Rockford, and he took me to this little sports bar called the Woodshed. And he started talking to me, just saying, "Hey, you've done some really good builds. We have RTTI, but we want to transition RTTI, because at that point, RTTI was more of just technical. How do you port a box? How do you build a crossover? This is how you hook our amp up." But they were never doing actual hands-on fabrication stuff. So Jerry had this idea that they wanted to develop this program called Top Gun and only bring out the best installers, in the country, and wanted to develop this fabrication program. And he thought I was the guy to do that. And I remember looking at him and thinking, God, Jerry, I've built some decent cars, but there's a lot of really good installers out there. And, I'm honored that you would, think that of me, but I just don't know if I'm that guy, if I'm ready for that. And, and he talked to me and just said, "Mark, I think you're the guy, you have the right attitude about it and stuff." So I left and went back to Tucson, and I actually thought about it for a couple of weeks, because that was a huge transition for me. And at the specialist, like I said, Charlie just treated me so good, and I just felt like I was on top of the world.
Right.
And so to pick up and go to a manufacturer, and as cool as that sounded at the time, it was kind of scary at the same time. A lot of pressure, and and again, I can't say, I've never been a big, person tooting my own horn.
Right.
I've never been that type of guy. And so for me, I thought, I've built some stuff, but that's a big challenge. So needless to say, I decided to do it. So I started at Rockford, I think it was August 1990. And my, mission was to develop this Top Gun program that they had already named, and had the concept for it, but there was no content. All they knew is they wanted to make an elite program where we would bring out 12 to 15 students or installers from across the U.S. at one time, and by invitation only. So the first thing I did at Rockford was, they didn't have a shop or a very efficient wood shop at all at that point. And I don't want to say they gave me, just an open checkbook, but at that time, as being 23 years old, I kind of felt like it was an open checkbook, being able to go out and at that time buy a unisaw and, high-end woodworking tools, and stuff like that. So that was August. My first thing I had to do there, though, was build a vehicle for CES. So it would have been CES 91 when that was displayed. And we built a Chevy Lumina van, and it was built to go to Europe. So it was called the Eurovan. So that was my first vehicle that I displayed at CES, being an employee of Rockford. So we displayed that, and then I really just got to work on what the content was going to be of this Top Gun program. Because again, we didn't have social media. We didn't, we had limited magazines even back, in those early days. So you don't really know what people are doing around the country.
Right.
You don't have a good, reference of what the ability is or what techniques people are using and stuff like that. So really what I did is I just went back and kind of studied how we built something, and just went through the fundamentals and everything on the fundamentals of building something, whether it was an amp rack or a door pod or a tweeter pod or whatever it was, everything evolved around the jigsaw. Everything that was cut out with a jigsaw. Well, we all know the jigsaw is not the most accurate tool. And the problem in car audio, majority of the time, is there's always a left and right. So trying to make a left pod match the right pod with a jigsaw was near impossible. So I started doing a lot of research and just looking into woodworking in general. And that's when I came up with the whole router concept. And that's when I did the first Top Gun, that's when we introduced all the router jigs. And just taught people how to manually build your first one with a jigsaw, sanding it, whatever, because that was the best we had. There were no lasers or CNCs or anything like that. So we'd build our first template out of, with a jigsaw. And then from there, we were teaching that, hey, you could copy that template. And not only for this car, but you could copy it and save it and use it on other builds down the road. And that's where the whole template jig thing really came from. And, I guess if I'd hang my hat on anything for car audio, I'm pretty confident I was the guy that did that from the beginning. And so we just kept refining the router process, and that's how we came up with stack jigs or jigs to build faceplates around radios by just using straight edges and building a fence around it. And we started doing all that type of stuff. And I remember guys coming and just being blown away by the concept, because I can't think of one student in those early years who'd ever seen anything like it, So our biggest battle back then, what we quickly saw, or the sales managers quickly saw, is how you're showing some really cool stuff to these guys, but the problem now is they're going back to their stores and telling the owners, we need a bunch of tools. Because they didn't have anything, especially a router. So the way Rockford combated it, and it was genius at the time, and guys like Jerry Cave, and people like that who were at Rockford in those early days had a great vision. And what they did is we did a couple Top Guns that were only for owners.
That's very
so
smart.
we brought the owner, we brought the owners of the stores out, and we showed them all about efficiency. And that's where everything kind of started to spark, because everyone wanted to do car audio, or wanted to do high-end car audio back then, but no one was making any money doing it. The cars were in the bay forever. It was tying your guys up. They'd much rather do a deck and 2 or a deck and 4 and make a lot more money. So we were able to show them, and we really, I really tried to dummy it down to where it wasn't even like that it had to be a speaker pod or anything, but a speaker adapter. And just showing them, hey, you're building these adapters already, and your installer builds this adapter for this Ford pickup today, and next week another Ford pickup comes in, and your other installer needs to build adapters again, and they're starting from scratch every time. So that's how we showed them that, hey, only one guy needs to build the first adapter, then we save the template, and we can keep doing it down the road. So we build this library of templates, and ultimately all it does is save you guys time, and you make more money. So we mainly in the beginning focused on just adapter plates, face plates for radios. That was a big thing. And the technique we came up with the strips to build the face plates for the radios, they all dug that, and they saw, hey, all I have to do is buy a router and a flush trim bit. And we showed them really basic ways back then where you just use a trash can, build a square table, mount your router to it, flip it upside down, and you have a router table. So we tried to make it really simple and cheap back in the early days, just to get the buy-in from the owners. Because if we didn't have the buy-in from the owners early on, the installers were just struggling. Most of them didn't have the money, or they didn't have the support from the owners to do these types of things. So, that was really the beginning of Top Gun and how that started.
Do you remember who was in your first class? Was there anyone like notable?
Greg Cobbs was in our very first class.
Awesome.
So, Greg and I have, laughed about that for forever. So we want to, so Top Gun continued for, I don't know, I probably ran that program for 10 years. And originally it was all domestic. And it was 12 to 15 guys that would come to Rockford. We did 2 classes a month. And so I feel Rockford, in the early days, they were really the company that built custom car audio, because they were spending the money to educate these people, where there wasn't really any other manufacturers in 1990 doing anything like that. Others came along after that, but I think in the early days, Rockford was really the pioneer of educating their installers, which, I think, ultimately built their brand, especially in the 90s. But I think they were, really responsible for expanding the knowledge and the ability of the installers, for sure.
100%. The guy that I started out sweeping his floors was an early Top Gun graduate, and that's how I got started, was watching him.
Yeah, I would love to see the family tree of that whole network and who attended, and then how that influence trickled down. Honestly, it's like when you look back at all the main influences of car audio, I feel like they all have a part of that program.
No, I think you're right on that. I mean, the Top Gun program was huge for the industry. I'm I'm blessed and honored to be part of that program, and to be part of that in the early days was huge.
Now that we've got up to there, how did your role at Rockford play out through the years? Like, you started with the demo car for CES and then into RTTI, and then obviously your responsibilities grew through the years. How did that come about?
So, like I said, for about the first 10 years, mainly what I did is ran the training department, and tech support also migrated into my department, which only made sense because originally tech support was part of customer service. We migrated it over to the RTTI area. So for the first 10 years, it was really teaching classes. We started to take more of that on the road with things like the early knowledge fests and stuff like that. And we started doing a lot of international stuff. So, I think in those 10 years, I trained in 50 countries.
Wow.
So travel all over.
What was the coolest place you trained at?
That's a tough one because there's a lot of great ones, but I would say probably one of my probably two coolest experiences would be Germany was really cool. The guys there were really into it and very knowledgeable in different ways. So that was really cool. And South Africa was really cool. The guys down there, at that time, again, just super motivated. Brett down there does a great job with the Rockford brand and still does. Mm-hmm. So those would be two of my trips that I would, two areas I'd really remember. But I had some good guys work for me through those years as well. Early on, the guy who helped me train, Rick Jones. Mm-hmm. So, Rick went on and, did the Alma Gates truck and other things at PPI. He's actually back at Rockford now. But Rick worked with me for a couple of years. We built, I think we did 2 CES vehicles together. We did a Chevy Dually and then a Chevy Impala that was pretty cool. And then after Rick moved on, that's when I hired Brian Schmidt. And Brian was in Utah at that point. It's kind of a funny story because Greg and Brian worked together at different stores at the hi-fi shop, and they had a van together. I actually tried to hire Greg originally and not Brian.
Yeah, Brian's so bitter listening to this.
And that's just, and it was more just I had a better relationship with Greg.
Well, yeah, he was at the first RTTI training.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, exactly. So
Stockton training.
But yeah, so the Greg thing didn't work out. He had a family, a wife. He just wasn't in a position to relocate at that point in his career. So that's when I hired Brian and moved Brian down from Utah, and that's where it all started. And it's kind of a funny story with Brian. You'll probably hate for me to share this, but that's when Brian had really long hair, had the really long mullet.
Yeah, we've seen the pictures.
And so the first day of work, I told him, I said, dude, you need to step your game up. We have to train people from all across the world, and I need you to have a little more professional appearance than the mullet. So I actually took him to a haircut place on lunch his first day.
Didn't Brian tell this story? I feel like Brian told this story.
He may have.
Oh, did he?
I think so.
There's a key component that I hope.
Yeah, you should go back and listen to Brian's episode. I think he told the story because if I know it, I feel like I've heard it.
The way I kind of coaxed him into it was I took him to a lingerie.
Yeah. Yes, I have
haircut
heard the story.
place.
Brian told the story.
Yeah, I remember this.
Yeah.
So that was his first day of work, and we got that mullet cut off, and the rest is history from there. And
that's awesome.
I knew Brian and Greg pretty well. Some of the dealers back then that were doing good business, the regionals, would have us set up like a one-on-one training with them. And so we flew Brian and Greg out to RTTI, and we actually, before I hired Brian, and we did like a weekend long, training with them. Rick Jones and I did that. So that's kind of how I got to know Brian and better. And then, like I said, that's when we hired him at that point.
So you met Brian through Greg initially?
I met Brian through Greg.
Okay.
Yep. Purely through IASCA contest, USAC.
So when Brian started, if he's like an 8 now, was he like a 6 or a 5 back then, or?
Brian came in. He was young and super motivated. Probably the guy that I can say was as crazy about it as I was. And, just wanted to learn. And, he had a lot of good qualities, much like he still does. But, we were a really good match together. And, we were super motivated about building the shop out better and, just learning new things. And so that, he came in pretty talented to begin with. So
I was just teasing. I was trying to get you to talk some shit.
If like you said, if he's an 8 now, he was probably a 5.5.
I'll remind him he's an 8 now.
You said 8.
So at what year is this when Brian's in the mix?
I believe Brian got in the mix in 96 or 97.
Okay.
Some of those years run together. I should probably have a better timeline than
it's
I do.
Hilarious.
So
When we have guests on all the time and they nail down years for like, that was 89. Like I can go through my life and I'm, other than like the kids, the year my kids were born, I don't know anything. 2007, 2006, 2000. I have no idea what happened that year. It's very impressive. What helps me
is that for a long time, I would change cars every couple of years.
Yeah.
So I would think about the story and I'd be like, what did I drive to work that day? And I'd be like, oh, it had to be within this 2-year period.
Right. Exactly. Well, and most of mine is based off demo builds we did.
Yep.
So, I can go back and know.
So what was your first big demo build?
The first big demo build was the Dodge Caravan for Rockford. And that was, the biggest build. And that was on the CES floor in 88.
Yeah.
And, back in the day, that was pretty cool because I did a dash in it, center console, a Nintendo. I bet you I probably have at least 15 CS builds for Rockford, and I've probably done 30 to 35 builds for them.
Wow. What was the most exciting project you unveiled at CES in your career, where you're like, I can't wait for people to see this?
They honestly, they all were kind of like that.
Yeah.
The early days were so exciting because, we would introduce, plexi or aluminum trim or something. And, it would be the talk on the floor because there would be nothing else like that. So each year, was, just got more and more motivating. And, in the early days, and there wasn't a lot of competition, to be honest. I mean, most of manufacturer builds in the 80s and early 90s were not that great. So, if I go back and look at some of ours, they probably weren't that great either. But at the time, that I think they were pretty good. As the years went on, you got to the mid 90s and stuff. Everyone upped their game. Alpine was building some great cars. There's a guy out of Tucson named Bill Wyco, and he owns a store down there, Audio 2000, and he was building a lot of the Lanzar stuff. And he built some pretty crazy stuff back for that day. So, I guess if I would say, when it really started to pick up would be the mid 90s when the talent really grew, and there are a lot better demo vehicles out there.
Yeah, the mid 90s is when it really just exploded, and as the glass kind of came onto the scene in a big way, and with the, you know, between what Rockford was doing and what Fish was doing and Carlson and like all of that stuff just blew up in that time period. I'd say like probably 94 to 98 was just this insane growth from everything was vinyl and acrylic and maybe some aluminum accents to everything has paint and airbrushing, and like just
exactly
the whole industry just exploded. It was awesome.
No,
it was a good time. Sorry you missed it, Matt.
No, when you went,
that's what got me into it. That's what got me into it.
You know, going back to your question, Maddie, about, you know, how the tree worked and, you know, who was influenced and stuff. You know, that's one cool thing for me to feel I was part of, you know, because whether it was Jeremy Carlsness or Mark Fukuda, you know, all those guys, you know, I definitely spent time with all those guys.
They all mention you when it comes to like a great influence within the industry.
So, you know, and it went both ways on that, especially with Mark. He showed me equally as many things as I showed him, just different. You know, I remember teaching him the router stuff, and for him, I remember it changing his game completely. The Blastro van that he built was really the first big demo car that he built using all the router techniques.
Yeah, I feel like that's a big thing with education is like, so somebody who doesn't know how to use a router, they learn how to use a router, and then they have the passion and drive to learn how to use it different than everyone else, right? It's much like with CNC nowadays or laser. How can you use that technology different than everyone else to set you apart, right? And I feel like if Fukuda did that with the router, he just had that knack to use it differently than everyone else.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, you get that skill set, and then you learn to kind of ratchet it up a little.
Exactly, and it just keeps going from there. You know, I think that's, you know, one thing again that, you know, I always tried to focus on with my career at Rockford was I wasn't in it for me. I wasn't trying to pat Mark Lowe on the back. I was trying to build the industry. And that's really what mattered to me, was to educate the industry and get the installers at the next level. And, you know, to be part of that, you know, when I look back on my career, I mean, that's really the thing I'm most proud of, is being part of those early days and educating people. I mean, I remember, you know, all my classes, you know, I'd always say, hey, there are no secrets. I'm laying it all on the table. We're not covering anything up with a black sheet. We're going to show you everything and all the techniques. And it's up to you guys, just like you said, Gary, to go out and expand on them. We're going to give you a solid foundation, which, you know, most of those guys didn't have back then. And so, you know, we focused on that foundation. First foundation was really how to do custom car audio and make money. That was the beginning of it, because, you know, the owners, they didn't want, you know, a lot of them dabbled in it, but then they like didn't want to do it because it was tying their bays up and they weren't making any money. You know, that was really my pitch on the whole thing. Hey, this is how to do some custom work and make money at it. So that was a snapshot of me at Rockford from 90 to about through my RTTI days, which ran through the early 2000s. And then I really transitioned into product development at that point.
And what drove that? Was RTTI slowing down or?
In the early days, it was, you know, so much of it was driven just by engineers. And, you know, Rockford, just like many companies, were making mistakes on designing of amps, for example. Where are the mounting holes? You know, how do you mount it? You know, they didn't think about things, you know, if they made a 10-inch subwoofer and if it was a P1 versus a P2 or P3, they were using different size baskets. So you couldn't change a subwoofer because the basket was an eighth of an inch bigger or whatever. So that's how they promoted me into product development.
That's
was
smart.
More from an application side. As we all know, you know, you got to be able to install the stuff and it's got to be easy. And if it's not, the installers are just won't use it. So I did that for the last 3 or 4 years that I was at Rockford for that stint. So my first stint at Rockford was from 1990 to 2005. And 2005 is kind of when a lot of things fell apart at Rockford and just in the industry. And we ended up laying off over half the people. And,
Wow.
And, you know, and fortunately and unfortunately at the time, I was part of that. I left Rockford in 2005, didn't do anything for about a year other than some side business. And that's when I got into the laser and started doing a lot more on CAD stuff. That's when I really got into SolidWorks and, you know, using a 2D program. At that time, I mainly used CorelDRAW. And I spent really that year just learning all that. And then in 2006, Rick Jones was actually at a car audio school called Mobile Dynamics. Mm-hmm. And Rick called me one day and said, "Hey, Tom Gazda, the owner of the Tempe location, wants to talk to you." And I said, "Okay, well, I'll go to lunch with him." But, you know, I kind of viewed them as, I don't know if that's what I want to do.
Right.
So I went to lunch with Tom and, you know, we kind of came up with a good plan. And so Tom hired me and I worked there for 2 years and developed, you know, a similar Top Gun type program that they didn't have. And Rick and I worked together there for a while, and it was a good little in between. And then in 2008, Bill Jackson, the president of Rockford, contacted me and courted me to come back. So then I started again at Rockford in 2008. And when they brought me back, it was originally to do some engineering support, you know, kind of like the role I was doing before I left, where working real closely with engineering on the product design and, of course, building some demo cars. So that's when we introduced the Sound Labs. So the first Sound Labs were Mercedes Sprinter vans, and they had 1215s in it. And when I developed those, it was really about changing the experience. You know, the demo had always been, oh, hey, let's play these songs, and you kind of, you know, do a song, and it's, you know, it is what it is. And I wanted it to be more like a Disneyland experience, where you shut the door and someone got in and there was a light show and the audio was automated. And we came up with this cool concept where they had a punch out button. So if it was too loud, there was a big red button that they could hit to punch out, and it would mute the audio. And we had a track that would come on that said, "You just got punched out by Rockford Fosgate." First 2 years back, we built 2 of those Sprinter vans. And, you know, they were a huge success just because it was something different. It wasn't a demo car that you couldn't touch or get in. I guess that's one thing, you know, going back to even the early days of my builds, I always wanted the builds, A, to be drivable and have the reps be able to drive them and not have them trailered. And B, I wanted them to be able to have people get inside them and touch them and, you know, build them durable enough to where they could withstand that and be demoed, you know, all day long. You know, I think we probably made some compromises back in those days not to make stuff maybe as pretty as it could have been to make it more functional. So we had those 2 Sound Labs, and then the last thing I built for Rockford demo-wise, was the Ford Transit, and we called that the Mini Sound Lab. And that was basically like the Mercedes van concept. We got better at it, did better automation in it. But, you know, those were something that I think at the time was unlike any other demo car, because there was nothing else out there that you could, you know, push a button and say, "I want a rock track," and it would play a rock track, or "I want a rap or country," or whatever. And the person who was demoing the vehicles could just push the button on the van and it would play that track. And probably the coolest thing about it was the experience was the same every time. We were able to control, much like a Disneyland ride.
Control
when
the
you
environment.
Go on something.
Yeah.
Yep. So that was a pretty cool time frame. That got us to like 2012 at Rockford that was the last build I did for them. After that, I transitioned more into just purely engineer support.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the early days where we started to do some motorcycle audio.
Yeah, the motorsports, yeah.
Yep, started playing the side-by-sides. My goal was to really educate myself on technology.
Mm-hmm.
So we got a ferrule arm so we could scan pieces. We transitioned that to a Creoform 3D scanner. I think we were by far the first car audio people doing anything like that. And 3D CNC machining. So we would machine all the prototype parts to check fitment and things like that before we ever sent them out for any sort of tooling. So that was a few years. Again, I had another great guy work with me during that time frame, Lee Teeples,
Mm-hmm.
which I brought in from Texas. And Lee's a super talented guy.
How'd you meet Lee?
I met Lee at CES, and I think that was 2012. I'm trying to remember what rep brought him over to me and just said, "Hey, you should talk to this guy."
Mm-hmm.
And Lee kind of had his own store going and some other, and he kind of been around a little bit. And so I did basically an interview at CES with Lee, and then went back to Phoenix and we talked some more, and then I offered him a job and relocated him to Phoenix, and
the rest is
from
history.
there.
Yeah.
Yep. And he was a huge asset to Rockford, a huge asset to me and my team. Again, much like I say with whether it's Fukuda or anyone else, I think I taught him a lot, but he taught me a lot too.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the best type of personality right there. Those are always the people who are at the top, is taking the information from the person who could be at the lowest totem pole, learning something from that person, and then using that like, hey, they actually do that very well, right? And then utilizing that aspect within what you do. I mean, that's how we all grow and transform into something better.
That's always, really been my stance on it, is you can always learn. Mm-hmm. You're never gonna, when you think you're the best, that's as good as you're ever gonna be.
Exactly.
You always have,
and it won't last.
And it won't last. It won't last. So I've always been that guy that I always have tried to extract whatever I can from somebody, even if he is that low guy on the totem pole. I mean, a pretty funny story that happened a couple of years ago. I was building a new house, and I was putting some ceiling speakers in. And so we don't even have furniture in the house yet. And I have the cable guy over, and he's, hooking up the cable, and this guy's super annoying. And just every time I was up on the ladder, getting ready to cut a speaker hole, he'd be, hey, Mark. And he would, want me to come look at something. And this guy's just driving me crazy. And so, I'd asked him, I'm like, hey, will you hook up this router for me or whatever it was? And I think it was a Netgear Orbi or something at the time. And he's like, I probably can't do that. I haven't been to Orbi school. And I'm just like, this guy's such an idiot. Just driving me crazy. So anyway, I'm cutting this speaker hole in the ceiling, and all the blow-in insulation's falling on the ground. So he sees me, picking it up, and he's watching me as I'm doing a couple throughout the house. And he comes over to me, he goes, I watched this thing on YouTube, and this guy was putting a ceiling speaker in, and he took a piece of fiberglass insulation after he cut the drywall, and he shoved it up against the blow-in insulation, and then none of it fell down. I'm looking at him, I'm like, shut the hell up. Just leave me alone. And so I'm talking to my wife later that night and telling her the story. I'm like, that guy's just a moron. So I'm driving the next day to Home Depot, and I'm thinking about what he said. And I'm like, you know what? I think he has something there. So sure enough, I go and I buy a little thing of fiberglass insulation at Home Depot and cut my next speaker hole, and I shove it up in there into the blown-in insulation. Virtually nothing falls on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So, like you said, that lowest guy on the totem pole.
They can always teach you something, and you always got to keep your mind open to that.
Exactly. And, when you don't, like you said, Gary, that's the end, and you're not going to be there very long. Yeah. So that, like I said, that was when I got into the engineering support at Rockford. That's when we started doing the first kit we did was the Polaris Razor kit. And Lee and I did that with virtually no engineering support at all. The engineers just weren't into it. I think Rockford was gambling at that point, and we didn't have a lot of support within the organization of doing these kits. So, I remember telling Jake Broughton at the time, who was vice president of new products, we can do this. We can do it in the back. So that's when we figured out the ferro arm and the 3D machining, and we brought that whole Polaris original Razor kit to market with Lee and I doing all the engineering to tooling. Mm-hmm. So, which was a pretty cool thing back then. So I continued, doing that for a few years at Rockford. We got into the motorcycle kits, and that kind of went crazy. And probably one of the coolest products I think that I've ever come up with was the Harley 6x9 adapter. The baggers, the biggest problem with putting speakers in the baggers was everyone had custom painted lids. And so if you bought an aftermarket lid, you had to have that painted to match. Mm-hmm. And that was always a hard sell with the owner of the bike. And I remember being at Sturgis one of the first years and seeing all this happening. And just being a simple car audio guy, I'm like, well, there's a pretty easy solution. We can just do a grill on the front and a grill on the back that sandwich together. Mm-hmm. And that's really where that came from. And I remember when we first, started, doing the concepts on that, we had zero buy-in within the organization. And, I remember, people high up in the company and consultants we were using at the time coming and saying, there's no way that these dealers are going to cut these bag lids. And, so we came up with the really cool solution where there was a template that went on top of the lid so that you couldn't scratch the lid, showed you exactly where to drill the holes and where to cut. Everyone just bought into it after they saw it. And that was, it was a huge, I think, change for the industry on the motorcycle side. And it's pretty cool. I ended up getting a design patent for that. So
that's awesome.
Nice.
Is that the only design patent you have personally, or do you have like
that
30?
No, that is the only design patent. Probably naive, and if I look back at my career, I probably should have made some different choices. And not being at Rockford the whole time, I probably should have went somewhere else and expanded, and I think I could have got more opportunity possibly. But to be honest, Rockford treated me really well. Mm-hmm. I definitely bled Rockford bread, and so I stayed there, even though the money was never as good as it probably could have been elsewhere. Mm-hmm. But it was a good ride, and so that, needless to say, that is the only patent. I probably should have approached other things along the way, especially a lot of the router stuff that we did. But again, for me, it was more about educating the mm-hmm. industry. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about, hey, Mark Lowe can develop this and get a patent on it. It was more, I want to teach mm-hmm. everyone how to be better and how to make this industry better. And that was really my focus and driving thing throughout my career was, not only about building Rockford, but it was about building the industry. Mm-hmm. Like you said, Gary, you can see people that I don't know the guy that you swept the floor for, but he probably wasn't even a Rockford dealer.
No, he
okay.
was.
But you know what I'm saying? A lot of those guys,
Yeah,
we taught thousands of guys, and some of them would go back, and next thing you knew, they were at an Orion dealer or Alpine dealer or whatever. So
yeah.
And really, my last part of Rockford, I got promoted to director of product development in 2016. So for the last 2 years, that was my role. So all the project managers reported to me, and basically, we brought the napkin sketch to reality. So that was a good couple years. Learned a lot of travel overseas. I mean, at least generally 4 trips to Asia a year. So one every quarter for a couple of weeks at a time. So got to learn a lot about manufacturing and just capabilities, what can be done and what can't be done. I think that if there's one downfall being a car audio guy or a fabricator is we can build anything we want. We're not restrained to the way the tool pulls or how thick something is, because
when you have to figure out what a draft angle is, all of a sudden it's like, okay.
Yeah, things change.
Maybe my idea isn't as good.
Exactly. So that was a lot of good learning experience for me.
What market taught you the most? Because how like we're in America and we just presume that we know a lot and we're the teachers, but obviously with you as a teacher in different markets, I'm sure there's times in which you're just like, wow, they know they're way far light years ahead of where I thought they would be.
I'd have to say a couple. Like I mentioned earlier, Germany, they had some really talented guys over there, and Rockford had some really good reps over there at the time that got us all around to the different dealers. So we learned, we saw a lot, and those guys they have different constraints, because the cars have to go through a lot more inspections and stuff than we do here. Right. They were really smart about integrating things and using factory mounting locations and stuff. They were way better about that in the earlier days than we were. I feel as Americans, because we're just like, we'll just drill a hole here. Just cut it. It doesn't matter where. You're
saying the mini truck scene is not big in Germany?
Yeah, no mini trucks. That scene was not big. So I think that was a huge influence just from that perspective. Because they had a different look on it. Japan was super educational and exciting. Those guys were so into the car audio thing.
And huge Rockford fans. Like Rockford in Japan is a big deal.
Yeah, especially back in the 90s. In the 90s, it was huge. And, I remember going to Japan, but a lot of other countries. And, we were treated, they thought we were royals.
Right.
And it's just like, no, I'm just some car audio guy from Wyoming. So, I remember we made a trip to South Africa, Mark Fakuda and I, and we actually went with Jerry Cave, who was the international sales manager at Rockford at that time. And we went over to help a guy over there with his SPL vehicle and teach a couple seminars. And I remember we had a party. They had a party that I guess for us per se at the time, where all the dealers came and they had banners with our names on it. And, it's kind of, it was weird at the time, but, everyone's coming up and wanting our autograph.
Yeah, you're like Aerosmith over there.
No, we were like, exactly at the time. So, the international experience and trainings back in the day were huge. And to be able to go do things like that with people like Mark and stuff, it really made that a fun time.
That's like a legit life memory.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. So what about now?
So in 2018, I'd been with Rockford for 25 plus years altogether. And I just decided it was probably time for me to do something else. And I decided that being retired would probably be pretty cool. So at 51, I retired.
Wow.
What is Mark Lowe doing to take up his day?
Using the passion that we all have for the car audio fabrication, really I've just kind of turned that more into the home side. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily audio, which, most of the things that all of us do, even on the car, isn't audio. Right. It's fabrication stuff. There's just audio is just a byproduct nowadays. Originally it was all about audio, but today it's more of a byproduct. So, I've really, just focused a lot more on my cabinet skills, and, it's been a big change for me. Just instead of using MDF or stuff like that, now I've been doing a lot more stuff with wood and, so learning more about, stains and, different types of finishes like that. So I've spent quite a bit of time doing that, building out a cool shop that I could have at my house so that I could continue doing the stuff that I like to do.
What's the thing that you're most proud of in your home right now that you've built? That you're like, it was a lot of work, but it's badass.
I know we built a really cool game room. We have a RV garage behind our house, and we divided that in half. Half of it's my shop and half of it's a game room, and it's a really cool vibe in there. It kind of made it, kind of an industrial retro vibe in there with, some really cool pop art stuff. And, that was a really cool build. And then in the house, I built, we call it the lounge. And it's kind of just a room that we, play games in and drink in. And I built some pretty cool stuff in there.
What's your go-to drink? In the lounge, you're sitting in your lounge, in your favorite chair. What is the drink that you're asking for?
Definitely Tito's soda.
Okay. We always try and ask each guest that. So if we ever bump into you in a social setting, we can get you exactly what you've asked for.
Usually a vodka soda of some kind would be my drink. So those types of things around the house. I've like I said, I've built a pretty cool shop where I have a CNC, a laser, saw stop, all the necessary stuff. And that's in my wood shop. And then the garage I'm in now is kind of my clean area. And that's where I do most of my CAD modeling. That's where I have my Formlabs 3D printer, my sewing machine. So and that's where I tinker on motorcycles and jet skis and stuff like that.
I'm sorry we're not a video podcast. We're only audio, but beautiful shop. Only white cars? Because I feel like I'm the same. I only do white cars. I don't know why. I just feel like they look cleaner than color cars. I see two white Porsches in the background.
Yeah, one's actually chalk.
As I say, is it chalk?
Yes, the chalk gray. Yep. So we have a chalk gray one and a white 911, and then I have a white Ford Raptor.
Okay, so white only. White's in season.
So that's been my go-to lately.
So here's a question for you, because I jotted down some questions. So from a fabrication standpoint, I know you're in Arizona, and I know it gets hot as fuck in Arizona. So fabrication in hot climates, what tips and tricks do you have for me? Because we know cars get like 200 degrees in the summer. Is there any special techniques or tricks that you do for hot climates?
I think a lot of that we've kind of learned through the years, and probably a lot of the people doing it now have already learned from all of us who made mistakes. Mm-hmm. I think some of the first stuff that we learned we couldn't use was hot glue, because you don't even need the gun.
Right. You just hold the stick in your hand.
You just hold the stick in your hand. So the hot glue, that wasn't a good go-to. Spray glue, originally, just using aerosol type spray glue. everything would stick fine initially, but you'd come out after a warm day and all the vinyls lifted. So we, learned early on that you definitely got to use a good contact cement.
What's your best contact cement? I'm trying to give something to everyone listening. So for the fabricators listening, what's the best contact cement for hot climate?
Just a Landau top adhesive.
Okay, it's pretty standard.
The standard, it's pretty standard trim adhesive. I mean, I've always been the guy that preached red contact adhesive versus the yellow.
Okay.
And my reason on that was,
so you can see
I watched you can see it because I used to watch a bunch of guys in RTTI in the early days, and they would spray it on, but there wasn't any on there. Mm-hmm. There wasn't enough, so it's like they weren't getting any adhesion. Mm-hmm. So then we switched to red. It's like now you can see it.
Okay.
So once you know what you're doing, the red's not as important. But I think in the early days of someone learning, the red definitely makes it so you can see it.
Okay, so favorite build of the 90s. This is a build that you saw that wasn't a Rockford product, that you saw competition, and you're like, that's executed pretty well. I'm pretty impressed.
Kind of two different levels on that, because I definitely have to include Mark Fukuda in those days for sure, whether it was his Blazer or the Blastro van. Mm-hmm. But they were very Rockford-like.
Right. I agree.
So the Alpine stuff, hands down. There are a couple years I can think of. I think the year that we introduced the dually, no, not the dually, the Ford Ram, and we had a bunch of really cool fiberglass painted stuff in there and a bunch of aluminum. I think that's the year that Alpine had, that Jeremy did was it a Civic, maybe?
That was Metra.
Oh,
right?
It would have been Yada. Well, Jeremy did the Civic with Metra, but the Civic was Yado and Brownie.
Okay.
Yeah, that thing was insane. Like, it was so ahead of its time with every inch of everything painted glass and air.
Yeah, that's the one. That's what I'm thinking of. That was the same. That was the same year that we did the Ram, and I think we each got a big trophy. I forget how they did it. I think we got, I don't remember if it was best of show or most unique or something, and then they got basically the same thing with different wording because they were both.
Right.
There was nothing even close to those two vehicles at that time. So that's definitely one that stands out for sure.
Yeah, I think that definitely pushed the bar pretty good with all the. This is one of the first ones I remember seeing with the fiberglass inlay into a fiberglass inlay into a fiberglass inlay, and it just stacked trim and trim. Yeah. I remember staring at it for a long time.
Yeah, super badass. Amazing for its time. It would be amazing today. I mean, so that's definitely one that stands out to me.
And in the best sounding car that you've ever sat in and listened to?
I'm probably not the best guy to answer that, because we were less focused on that and more focused on the SPL.
What you were talking about, the tap out button in the vans that you guys built. What has anything tapped you out before?
I mean, some of Steve Mead's stuff has been really loud for sure, and aggressive. Unfortunately, I can't say anything's really, and that's probably not a good thing to say. And I know I'm paying for it today, and I'm further down in my life from a hearing perspective. So,
hey, I made it through one of your demos without tapping out. I was damn close to hit the button, though.
Yeah, I mean, again, the Sound Labs are kind of one of those things where we definitely could have pushed it further, and they could have been louder. But, we had to kind of put it to where it was like, it was loud and it would make some people tap out, but, it had to be to where, because they were going to all sorts of different events. The Sound Labs went to more non-car audio events than car audio. And, a lot of people have never experienced anything close to that. So it was kind of a line we had to draw where it's like, okay, we want it loud. We want the experience to be really good, but we don't want to just scare these people away from it either. Because
you don't give anybody a heart attack.
Well, at the end of the day, we're trying to sell product. we want them to leave. We want, the goal was to leave with, hey, Rockford's badass. We want to go buy that. And, not just, oh shit, it was so loud I couldn't even sit in there. So it was kind of like a fine line that we had to, dial that thing in, and it had to be able to do that every day on the road, with no one working on it. So yeah, it couldn't be torn down, every weekend and woofers replaced and stuff like that. It had to be, no different than a race car. You can make them go so fast and they're still reliable, or you get that extra 5 or 10 miles an hour or whatever it is, and then it's like they break all the goddamn time.
And then here's a question that we ask every guest, and I'm very excited to see how you answer it, because it can go one of two ways, right? So your best demo track, and tread lightly because you're a Rockford guy. It could be an SPL track, or it could be something that you're evaluating an audio system for its entirety. You answer it how you shall. If you're evaluating an audio system for the first time, what song or 2 songs are you playing?
This sounds really bad, but that was never my deal. I always had guys who did that. I was never the sound guy. Just being honest. I was more about making it look cool, build a really good system and have it be reliable and serviceable. And I was never the guy that tuned it or did that stuff. That was just really never my. That's kind of when I just signed off and turned it over to whoever else it was at that time. So I really don't have a good answer for you.
But even after a long build, nobody's around. You're sitting there, you have a hot aux, and you're just trying to play some music. You don't have one song that Mark Lowe is just going to slam on the aux.
No, I really don't, and it's kind of sad. It's kind of embarrassing. I guess there were so many different songs, whether year by year, I can't even really think of anything that stands out. And I know that's weak sauce. And it probably went completely opposite of what you thought it would go.
Yeah, I was thinking you're either going to go sound quality or you're going to go SPL.
Yeah, it was always more the loud SPL with vocals. Some song that had a lot of bass but had good dynamic range. And I could probably say something, but I'd probably say something that would just embarrass myself. So I'd rather just leave it at I don't.
Oh, that's part of the fun.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that.
We'll let him off the hook.
Weak. Failed that question.
So finally, who is your biggest influence amongst your career, or influences? Who made you?
Well, Ron Trout definitely is in that arena. If I had to say someone, early on really motivated me and I looked up to, Ron Trout's the guy. He was super motivating to me to be that guy. When he used to run RTTI, and I remember once I started at Rockford, and I became the director of RTTI. Ron was director of product, the director of new product development. And I remember we used to have to fill out a thing from HR, and it was like, where do you see yourself in 2 years or something like that? And what I wrote was, I want to be director of product development. Because again, I saw Ron's footsteps and kind of where he went. I'm like, that dude, he has it together. So he was super motivating to me from the car audio side. Definitely other people that, were the ones that influenced me and brought me along, that, weren't from the fabrication side per se, like Ron, but Jerry Cave at Rockford, who was a regional sales manager at that time. He was the sales manager that would always come over and check on us. We would be working late, and you guys all know, the builds never go like you think, and you're there at midnight and beyond. And Jerry was always the guy that would come check and, just see how you were doing. And it always just be motivating, because he'd look at what you were building. He's like, oh, that's really cool. And So he was a huge support for me through a lot of years too.
If you had to put together like a team to build a car now, like for yourself, which guys would you grab?
Wow. There's so many good ones. The talent level, the talent pool is, higher than it's ever been. And the stuff people are building out there is just amazing. And for me to, name somebody, I'd probably be missing a lot of people because I've been out of it for 4+ years at this point almost. Jeremy Carlson would be high on the list. If I had an old Camaro or something, it would be going to him. Mm-hmm. Gary, you'd be high on the list too. No different than you would, Matt. There's so many good guys out there. If I was to build a team, it would be hard for me to choose who the best 5 were, for sure. Yeah. If I was to say, hey, who's the one person? If I only get one, it would be Jeremy.
Mm-hmm. I think we all would agree with that. Yeah.
I think that's a pretty solid choice.
Jeremy would definitely be the one. If I only got one guy, that would be my go-to.
He's a good dude and insanely talented and continues to push all of us. He pushes the limit, and I think that pushes
for sure,
else, which is awesome.
No, it's Jeremy and I always laugh because he came to a Top Gun that we taught at the Lake of the Ozarks back in early. I think he was only a year or two into his career, and he's told me many times, he's like, when I went back after you showed me the router stuff, it changed my life.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, literally.
So so Jeremy and I go way back, and that guy is just taking everything and, just went crazy and expanded, done so much for the industry, not only the car audio industry, but just the fabrication industry, for sure. So, and, I think the thing I admire about Jeremy so much is he's a lot like me, where, he always wants to try new technology. Yeah. I love it to see that he's on the Creaform 3D scanning bandwagon that I was on, that they're 3D printing so much stuff, that they're 3D machining, they're just next level for sure.
My favorite quote, Mark, is the master has failed at everything the beginners never tried, because it's so true. You have to try everything. You have to fail to learn, to get better.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I said, my line, I guess I'd always use, it's not how good you are, it's how good you can fix what you fucked up.
Yeah. Because
some of my best builds or coolest thing on my builds were mistakes.
Yeah.
I did something wrong, and it turned into this really cool thing that might have only taken an hour or two. I remember Brian Schmidt and I used to laugh because we'd put hours and hours into, whether it's machining, these aluminum battery bus bars. I was really into the battery bus bars for a few years on some of the Suburbans we did. And, they were crazy for the days. And we would spend a month building all these bus bars. And then we would do I remember, I think it was on the dually, I did a stacked acrylic trim piece with black and red acrylic and glued it together and then chamfered the edge and polished it. And it was like an afterthought. And oh my God, that's the most popular thing. And everyone talked about it. I'm just like, what about the month I spent back here on the battery bus? Oh, those are cool, but that acrylic piece is really cool. So, it's, that's one thing I learned. It's like, sometimes it's the simplest things that stand out to people.
Right.
You can bust your tail on a lot of different things and, put a whole bunch of effort and time into it. And then it's like one little thing that most times, I think you guys would agree with me, it's kind of an afterthought. It's like, oh, I should put this trim piece on this, or, do whatever. And it's like, oh, that's the thing that gets talked about.
Right.
And everyone's gravitating towards. So
I had a car like that we had probably collectively spent, I mean, if it was one dude, it probably would have been 3 months on this entire car. and it got done to having to build just a little block off plate underneath the rear deck when the trunk closes. It just needed about 2 inches of trim, and it was one of those things that knocked it out in like maybe 2.5 hours after this, multi-month build. I got done with it. I'm like, that's one of the coolest things I have ever built, and it was just in an afternoon and done and upholstered and bolted into the car. And I wish all things were that easy, and sometimes you have to build the rest of it. It could be that, or
a wrong hole cut in a door, and all of a sudden you're venting speakers, and the customers are late.
Exactly. Yeah, no,
ported doors.
I mean, I have a similar story on the Chevy Impala that Rick Jones and I built, which was back in 94 or 95 CES, and we spent a month plus building the trunk out, and it had all these painted pieces and really complex fiberglass pieces. And the thing that stood out was I built these right angle brackets that held a trim piece that covered the hole for the trunk hinges. So when you would open the trunk, you wouldn't see through the slot, or we didn't have to use snow brushes. Mm-hmm. And so I came up with this simple thing, just an angle bracket with a piece of vinyl on it, basically. And that was the thing at CES that year that everyone was like, "Oh my God, that is so cool." I'm like, really? That's what you're talking about.
I have 6 weeks worth of sanding in this trunk, and you like the one little vinyl piece.
You like the piece of angle iron with a piece of vinyl on it. So, well, guys, this is
it was fun.
Again, I feel honored that you included me on this list of people that you guys said you've already done this with. I mean, that list is top-notch people, and so for me to be on that list, I feel honored, and I really appreciate you guys reaching out to me to include me in on it.
Yeah, and it's very fun because the more stories we get from you, it fills in this timeline of important car audio history. So as each person tells their story, it literally fills in this immaculate family tree of car audio, if you will. And it's something I feel like we've never physically known as an industry, to see each person's perspective, where they were at in the United States during this crazy culture that's exploded and become what it is now.
Yeah, a lot of times I always kind of referred to myself as the ghostwriter. As I was kind of the guy behind the scenes. I never wanted, I never tried to be famous or wanted the glory of it. So, I think a lot of people, they don't even know who Mark Lowe is. He was just, they know more about, that Rockford van or that Rockford dually or whatever. That was really cool. But, I was never really that guy that, wanted to autograph it or have the glory of it. I was more about, like I said, building the industry. And, I was loyal to Rockford. It was, hey, I want to build the best vehicle I can for them.
Now, how many manufacturers had a home shop or workshop like you guys had? Were you guys the only people that you know of that had that detailed, efficient type of shop?
I think in the early 90s, for sure. I think I've never been to it, but from what I've seen, Alpine had some nice stuff for a while too. They had a good run at it. I think most of the other manufacturers, the majority of them didn't do it themselves. Mm-hmm. They outsourced it to different builders, or different shops. And, most manufacturers didn't do it. I mean, I think the two that stand out are Rockford and Alpine.
I agree.
They were the ones that were doing it in-house. They're the ones that had the talented guys, and we're trying to push the industry and for better cars, no different than today. If we say, "Oh, Jeremy, he's built this," and it's really motivating. For us back in those days, and I know the guys at Alpine feel the same. It's like it was motivating for us to push the envelope, and for people, and what I loved about trying to be on the edge of that was, coming back the next year and seeing how much better people got or how they expanded on it. Like you said, Gary, taking the router and what else can you do with it? And, just the builds in general, and people, seeing something and then, putting their own twist on it. And, that was always exciting for me to see what the next thing was.
Yeah, it was fun to watch people dream and try to outdo each other and just try to make the most extreme thing that they could, minus maybe that year or two when guys got to putting 50 or 60 TVs in one car. That's about, I think, the point where it got out of control.
For sure.
Side mirror, sun visors, review mirror, tail lights. There's TVs everywhere.
I think it was Excel maybe one year had like a Mitsubishi Eclipse or something in their booth, and it was like literally the A pillars had like 6 TVs down each one, and I was just like, "Yep, we jumped the shark. This is the one. This is what happened." My apologies to whoever built that.
Time to do something different. So I think we all see that through the years of whether it was people get on the on the painted bandwagon or. And it's just evolved. Everything was carpet or ozite, as we used to call it back in the 80s. And, then it transitioned to vinyl or tweed. Then it's, we started adding some plexi and aluminum and then painted stuff. And it's like, just like you say with the TVs, people will like want too much. It's like, okay, not every single thing needs to be painted. It looks like a hot tub, or whatever. It's, or too much vinyl or too many TVs, and I think that's what, guys like Jeremy, have done such a good job with is it's a good mix of different materials, and that's something we always tried to preach at Rockford was, just coming up with a good design and pushing it and using different materials.
Yeah. The best fabricators have creative restraint.
For sure.
Now, this was fun. I appreciate you sincerely for doing the podcast with us. It was absolutely excellent to hear your side of your journey and how you got into this and how you became you and how you've influenced these unbelievably other influences in our industry. And my friend, we talked about the bottom of the totem pole. You are near the top of the totem pole, my friend.
Well, that's an honor to, for you to say that. And, it's like I said, it's just an honor for you guys to think of me to be in this elite group. And, it was a good run. It was a great journey through my years at Rockford and owe the world to them, mainly just because they gave me the opportunity. All the router stuff and all those types of techniques, those only happen because I was given the opportunity. When I was in the install bay busting my tail, you don't have time to think about, well, what's a better way of making this trim piece other than using my jigsaw? You're like, I just got to get it done so I have the next car. And, so for me, given that opportunity at Rockford, that's really what allowed me to do that. I was no better than any of the other good installers. I was probably not as good, but I was given a great opportunity and I was able to take that and try to focus on the stuff that I thought would make all the installers better.
Yeah, it did work. It worked well.
So just being able to, slow down and, think about, the basic steps of the build. As simple as it seems today, back, in the 80s, it was the jigsaw, period.
Hey, some dude had to invent the wheel, and then everything from there got a little easier for everybody else. So we definitely appreciate you taking that opportunity and basically starting this wheel rolling down the road of.
Well, it's been exciting for me too, to see what people have done with it, to see how successful Brian Schmidt's become, over a lot of the things that we did back in the 90s. Quite honestly, he's taken it and put his own spin on it and developed new stuff as well. When you go back to it, so much of it is still eliminating the jigsaw for these guys. Because, more and more guys today, as you guys know, have CNCs and lasers. And so we're not worrying about how we're going to cut the piece out. We're going to cut it on the laser, the CNC, and we have a perfect template. But the guys that don't have that, that's where it's been so positive with the way Brian has supported those guys, because, with his templates and stuff like that, that allows those guys to be able to produce nice parts and repetitive parts, and not, have a lot of expensive tools or a lot of knowledge. So hats off to him. He's done a good job taking that and making it mainstream.
I can only imagine if there was no Mark Lowe, how different our industry would have been. So for that, again, I thank you.
Well, wow. Just for you to say that's huge.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not that guy that feels that I was, responsible for it, or, again, I think I was blessed and I was given an opportunity. And I think there's 100 other people at the time, if they would have been given the opportunity, they probably could have done it too. So, I'm fortunate I was given the opportunity, and we were able to do what we did for the industry. Because for me, and I've repeated myself a bunch of times on it, the industry was the most important to me. I was never that guy that was going to hide how things were done and secretive, because the techniques are the techniques, but if you don't have the design eye, that makes a difference.
For sure.
Just because you know how to use a CNC or a router jig doesn't.
You still have to have the execution to compete.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's something that's just hard. That's the hard part to teach. Some people get good influences and they learn, and they're around good people and they get better. But there's people that are just blessed with that ability. Because at the end of the day, we're all designers and artists. And if you don't have that side of it, you're not going to build the coolest cars. You can have all the tools in the world and all the techniques, but if you don't have the design side, it's going to be a good build, but it's not going to be the epic build.
Well put.
Yeah. We'll end on that. Again, I appreciate you so much for coming on. Again, I know you're probably the most humble person in car audio, but understand how much car audio appreciates Mark Lowe.
Thank you again, guys. Again, it was just an honor to be invited to this, and I appreciate the time that you guys spent with me.
For sure.
For sure. Thank you.
All right.
And